Well, thank you very much for the introduction. Hello from Canada. I hope you can hear me.
Yes.
Okay. So thank you to Cyrus for running this exciting project. I'm sorry that I could not come in person. This is already the third week of our semester here at McGill, and it's an onerous week. Yeah, I saw the thumbs up, so thanks. And I fear, since I missed many of the panels, that I might reopen some of the discussions, some of the points that have already been settled. So I apologize for that in advance. I have read most of the papers and have really read excellent papers, and I'm really excited about this project. So just let me start. Around 3 years ago, Cyrus has approached me to write the sort of the launch chapter of the volume. We did discuss structure very early on. I was thinking about whether it's thematic or whether it should be periodical. I thought periodical would be better. And so we decided to think about actually the 4 periods that are in my paper. Now, this is a workshop, I understand. What I would like from you to hear is 2 kinds of feedback, or 2 kinds of really tough love. First of all, how does the chapter fit? What needs to be added? What needs to be dropped? What needs to be changed? And I also want to hear more about factual errors or omissions. So please, be very frank. Also, you can send me an email, of course, later on. I'm not really a specialist of the Middle East, which has drawbacks in terms of intimate knowledge of the field, but it has also some advantages, I think, because I'm not burdened by some of the historiographical debates. So, of course, much of my involvement in the project comes from my both Cold Wars, which is only 5 years old, and my background is looking at the Middle East in comparative terms with the Cold War in Europe, East Asia, and work out differences and similarities. And I think the Middle East, in comparison to East Asia, East Asia and Southeast Asia, in comparison to Europe, is in many respects fundamentally different. This might come through from my paper. I listened to the end of the last panel and understand that there are other opinions, and that's great. I also want to work in terms of comparative terms over time. This is why I think the periodical approach really works. So, just in terms of terminology, I agree with Mathilde von Bülow and Martin Thomas that this is, as they write in their paper, that we have a problem of flattening a huge geographical space, right? So there is the Middle East, it's the core land of Egypt, and we have North Africa. These are historically and culturally and politically different actually places. I also think we should think about the non-Arabic world, so Turkey, Iran, Afghanistan, Pakistan, sort of the periphery, but they really matter in the story. But I leave it up to Cyrus to decide about the precise terminology for the whole volume. Now, so since I really believe that the global Cold Wars or the regional Cold Wars of Europe, Asia, and the Middle East are fundamentally different, I think I came out with this early on in the chapter. I really think that the global Cold War was not that involved in the Middle East. If you compare it with East Asia and Europe, in East Asia, the United States goes to war twice. Korea, Vietnam. The Vietnam War, the Vietnam Wars is a conflict that starts in 1946 and runs into the 1980s with huge loss of lives. The division of Europe is also fundamentally different from what is happening in the Middle East. So we really talk about 3 completely different beasts here. My argument is that in terms of global involvement, the period from 64 to 74 is probably the one where the global Cold War is mostly involved in the Middle East, and then maybe at its periphery, the Afghanistan War. So this is why I want to talk first about sort of the 2 earlier periods, what I call the tentative Cold War, 1945 to 55, and the rising Cold War, 55 to 64. The great powers, and I think this is something that was also mentioned in the earlier panel, is we can't really talk about 2 superpowers in 1945. We talk about three, in my view, different great powers: the United States, the Soviet Union, and the United Kingdom, or the British Empire. So we have to think a little bit also how these three powers think about the Middle East. I definitely think the Soviet Union was not really interested in installing in the Middle East. The United States probably still saw the British leading Middle Eastern policies. However, there are also, of course, internal conflict lines we should not actually dismiss, between Egypt, Saudi Arabia, and the Hashemites, and of course between the Arabs and the Zionist movement that becomes in Israel. I think, this goes back to the last panel again. The Americans were interested, of course, in the Middle East. I think the formal involvement really is a result of the Korean War, in which the Americans globalized the Cold War. And I think this is really, and I agree with that, this is an overestimation of Soviet capabilities and intentions. And the Soviet Union is playing a catch-up game, ultimately. So by 1955, I think we, for the first time, do have an involvement of the global Cold War. On the one hand, Soviet interests in the post-Stalinist leadership under Nikita Khrushchev, but also Egypt pulling in the Soviet Union through the arms deal. That's a result also of the increase of conflict, military conflict between Israel and Egypt. With the hot clashes in Gaza in February and May 1955. And then there's an American reaction to a certain degree, and a British reaction. This is anti-Nasserite. And so it is Suez really that draws in the great powers to a certain degree. Again, interestingly, the Soviet Union, the United States do not side really on different sides in 1948 with the foundation of Israel, and they don't side with different sides also in 1956 in Suez. And 48 they side with Israel, and 56 with Egypt, in fact. But the Soviet Union can benefit actually from the Suez crisis, because it can present itself as the supporter of decolonization. In this way, the Soviet Union is also pushing and being pulled in. And it's a push-pull actually function that I observed. Now, 55 to 64, 56 to 64 would be the second period. This is really also the period where Khrushchev engages with the Third World, very clearly. And the Americans react in times of the Middle East. It's what one of Salim Yaqub 20 years ago called containment of nationalism. This is also a rearrangement, actually, of the fault lines in the Middle East. So it was Egypt and Saudi Arabia that, opposed the Hashemites after 45, and now there's a kind of Saudi-Hashemite reconciliation. Egypt is actually the odd man out in the trilateral relationship. This is also the period of intense inner Arab conflict, right? What Malcolm Kerr has called the Arab Cold War, which is of course not an ideological Cold War in terms of the global Cold War. This is the period where Israel moves from what I would consider American regional liability to an American strategic actual interest. So there is this change of how the United States actually sees Israel between 56 and 64. And this is why I see the full Cold War really only entering the Middle East in 1964 and after. This is when the powers, the great powers, the two sides of the global Cold War line up neatly behind actually either the Arabs or Israel, with the exception, of course, of Romania and France. 1967, neither the United States nor the Soviet Union wanted this war, but it just reveals how many pre-commitments both sides have already made to actually the different sides in the Middle East. Egypt is stuck with what it itself considers actually the lesser of the two great powers or superpowers. It understands that it has lost actually the relationship to the United States. It is stuck with actually the lesser of the two great powers. So there is an insight that it probably has bet on the wrong horse in their relationship to their great powers. This really, in my view, again here, local agency is important. The transition from Nasser to Sadat, the insight that working together with the Soviets does not really work in the interest of Egypt, and sort of the switch to the Americans by 1972. Timing was bad, of course. 1972 is the year when Nixon went to China and Moscow, and the Vietnam War finally actually sort of goes into the American direction after the failed East offensive. So Nixon does not respond, and that's then the setup for the October War. October War is, for me, a desperate attempt to engage with the Americans, to get the Americans involved in the game again, to force Israel to the table, and to also share responsibility for the Palestinians. It's one of Egypt's self-arrogated, actually, policies that Egypt is the guardian of Palestinian interests, and it has failed in doing so very clearly, and now it just tries to share it to the United Nations. And this leads me then to the final subchapter 75 to 84, where superpower behavior is not very constructive. And I agree again with what I said in the last panel. The Soviets really didn't have a lot of assets. Iraq was leaning towards actually Soviet Syria, yes, and then that was it. And maybe Algeria, and then the PLO and other actual movements. So the Soviet Union isn't really a major player after 73, and it's also systematically excluded by the Americans. So this, but American policy is also not very constructive, and this leads, for me, then to attempts in the Middle East to solve the problems, actually at the regional level. That would be the Israeli-Egyptian approachment. And then, of course, the rise of Islam, and I have an excellent paper about this too on this conference, so I don't want to talk too much about that. But this is, for me, the period post-74, where the Cold War really does disappear from the region. And by the early 1980s, with the rise of political Islam, that's, for me, a pretty clear indicator that the Cold War is not an order in principle in the Middle East any longer. So I want to conclude here. I have, of course, I really want to have tough feedback. I'm not in this field. I'm an outsider. I also want to have feedback on what I should write in the conclusion. Cyrus and I had decided early on to leave that open. I also realized that I need to talk about the end of the Afghanistan war. I need to talk about the Palestinian issue probably. So I'm really now expecting a really tough love from all of you. Thank you very much.
Okay, who would like to give tough love first?
Yeah, hi, thank you. Can you hear me through the mic?
Yes.
Great. Thanks for that paper and for those big framing questions. And I think my comment is really actually broader, kind of coming out of other conversation we've had today too. But I noticed that you talk about the Cold War almost like it's a thing. It appears, it disappears, it sort of comes and goes as an external actor in the Middle East. And I wonder, we talked in the last panel about bottom-up and top-down processes, and I just think it's something for you guys to consider. Do you want to see the Cold War as a kind of diplomatic moment, a military intervention, or is this a time period in which we understand the MENA to be changing in certain ways, and certain actors, different actors, have different ideas about whether they are or are not aligned with the Cold War? So how we define kind of it as a process, as opposed to a thing, as opposed to, I expect that there are going to be subjective decisions all the way around. So I think that's something, if you want to have a broad audience of people, I guess I asked this as an environmental and social historian, so for me, these kinds of things, and thinking from the region, not just kind of from the more global context, that tension is something you should follow, I think, and bring out a little bit more, and I think that's one of the interesting things that's happening across the papers. So, yeah.
Well,
Lorenz,
let's just answer directly.
Let's sample always, let's say, 3 questions and then do them together, okay? Okay, let me just make 2 points. The first point is historiographic. as you know, this companion is divided into two parts. The first part is an updated version of a more classical take on the Cold War, right? Where that turns around external powers and the roles in the Middle East, though we had always said that we would, a little bit more than classical approaches, give more weight to how internal, basically actors, political state actors, involve those external powers. The second part is what you just talked about. Right? The question now that I do have to myself, and maybe this is something I definitely need to bridge in the introduction, is, well, do we need to bridge these two things? And how do we need to do this? Right? No chapter can do everything. So maybe this will be my burden, basically, to do. But I do think that possibly the second next step would be this. That's point number one. Point number two now, this is a very general point. Point number two now concerns Lawrence's paper, Osama's paper, maybe also Guy's paper, and basically general papers that, chapters that deal, let's say, with really large global actors, okay? So here are two different ways of thinking about what the global Cold War actually is. One is the one that you, Lawrence, basically talk about, right? And you say the global Cold War truly, fully aligns with a particular regional Cold War, namely the Arab-Israeli conflict, only in 67 to, let's say, the mid-1970s, right? Because at that point in time, so it's a sort of a almost formal, explicit alignment, because at this point in time, you have the US on one side, the Israeli side, and whatever the, let's call them moderate Arab countries, while the Soviet Union is on the other side, right? And now, I think that Osama, in a certain way, and maybe, I don't know about Guy, but Osama, I think, where is he? Here, okay, sorry. In a certain way, I think what the United States is doing from the mid-1940s onwards, and definitely by the 1950s, is also a part of the global Cold War, right? Because the policies the United States is basically executing in the Middle East, partly by invitation, the Turks and the Iranians are really afraid of the Soviets, so they invite them in, right? Are directly part of the global Cold War. They're about containment. But they are not in the same way part of the global Cold War that you, Lawrence, talk about. So I wonder, and I think there's a very productive tension here between these two different ways in which the global Cold War actually basically takes place in the Middle East, right? But only in one, namely yours, Lawrence, is the Soviet Union a really central player. While in the one that you talk about, Osama, the Soviet Union is somebody to be contained and kept out. But I think nonetheless, maybe we should call this, and you do, Lawrence, as well, right? Call this global Cold War already. So sorry, I'm going on, right? So let me just stop here, but say, I think to me these are two different ways of actually, two different meanings of what the global Cold War actually means in the Middle East, and perhaps elsewhere as well.
Hi, everyone. I had a question in part following what you were just saying, Cyrus, that raised a larger question for me about this. I feel like we keep coming back to 73 as a kind of end point, followed by 78. But I'm wondering why the invasion of Lebanon and of Beirut is not coming into this. So especially thinking about that invasion of Lebanon within the argumentation of Rashid Khalidi as being equally a military action of the United States, why end in 73? Why end in 78? Why not push this a little farther?
Lawrence, do you want to take D3? And really, mine is sort of more a very airy-fairy, I don't know, point. So you can totally ignore it too, and we can talk about it later.
All right. Well, thank you very much. I mean, all these questions go to the heart of a problem, and I have to make now a confessional, so that I have now done Cold War history professionally probably over 30 years, and I I think I know more and more, but as I know more and more, I know actually less and less. And I just taught a Cold War class at the 300 level, and I started it with the question, what is the Cold War, right? And I frankly find it more and more difficult to really answer that question. And I think to a certain degree, the first question and Cyrus's comments point to that direction. Is it a process? Is it a thing? Is it a time period? I have come down to thinking about the Cold War not as the paradigmatic explanation of the second half of the 20th century, or most of it, but as one of many narratives, that sort of meta-narratives that try to explain how the world develops. Another one is in decolonization. This is why I start my book Cold Wars with decolonization that intersects. Others could be globalization, economic globalization. So if you now think about the Cold War as one of many narratives and not as the only one, that might actually help us to open up new avenues of understanding what's going on in the Middle East. In the book, I talk about different Cold Wars. Of course, this chapter is based on my larger book about a global Cold War, about regional Cold Wars. And these regional Cold Wars can be a mix of pre-existing local conflicts that have nothing to do with the Cold War, of Cold War conflicts that are directly Cold War conflicts. I mean, Afghanistan might be actually the best example, and of sort of something in between, spill-off conflicts. Middle East is probably full of them. I mean, the classical one would be the Sino-Indian border war of 1962. Where it's not really a Cold War conflict, but you can't explain it without a Cold War either. So we have now to think about the different levels of conflict, whether it's part of the global Cold War, part of the regional Cold War, or part of a not Cold War, right? So that's sort of where I stand. I find the Middle East is a particular hard place for me to think that through, because there are so many mixed cases, right? So now Lebanon, this is a really good question. This is one of the things that I sort of dodge this bullet in my own work. It's also a long-term, problem that arises since the 1920s. It's a multi-ethnic and multi-religious state with a very sensitive internal balance, right, between different groups. It tries to preserve it. It tries to object to Syrian attempts to basically embrace it in the 1940s as the Arab League actually emerges. And in 1975, the Palestinian conflict that is carried in since 1947, particularly after 70, 71. So why not think about 1982, 1983 as a kind of a point of a major point, a turning point? In the paper, I probably didn't do it. In the book, I clearly see it as a turning point. I think this is not an intervention of the scale of the Korean War or the Vietnam War after '64. It's a smaller scale intervention. It's partially also UN-induced. It's basically a stabilizing intervention. But it's only one. It's also one that lasts actually very briefly. Right? The Americans do, the French and the Italians do retreat relatively quickly, right? In the face actually of Islamist violence. So in the book, I make the argument that this is actually really a sign that the Americans or the West doesn't really understand what the changes are on the ground in the Middle East. So that's my short answer to a really big question, a good question, I think.
Yes. Sorry.
Thanks a lot. Hello, Lorenz. Roland Pop from Zurich. Thanks a lot. Just very quickly on periodization. First of all, I don't understand the 1964 because of the many very eventful years in the Middle East. 1964 stands out as the one year when not much happened. So perhaps you can elaborate on that a bit. And wouldn't be 66 be a better year when the Americans give up on their regional strategy and come back to a global strategy, or better domestic strategy in their approach to the Middle East by giving up the rapprochement towards Gamal Abdel Nasser? And on the second, just to add to the Lebanon point, actually, I just only noticed that we might have all been fooled by Henry Kissinger once again, because there's this story that the Cold War is not an ordering principle really very much in the later period, but Lebanon really stands out. There is a rather unresearched big crisis, military intelligence crisis with the Soviets about an SA-5 missile in Syria, and there's not much been written about that, but I noticed from looking into the Reagan Library documents that this is very, very serious, for example. We have also the Americans being convinced during the Iranian Revolution that the Soviets once again want to attack Iran and march into the Middle East, and that doesn't happen in the middle period, which is also intensely Cold War. And we're going back to all that nuclear planning, just throwing tactical nukes on Soviet divisions in Iran, and that there's an enormous amount of covert action going on in the 1980s as well. So perhaps we do have to revise our view of this later period not having been affected by the Cold War that much.
Okay, let's do a relay.
Hey, Lawrence, it's Chris Dietrich. How's it going? So, yeah, this isn't tough love or anything like that. I just really want to know your opinion. If you were to include in the conclusion something about 1990 and 1991 and the Gulf War and the beginning of the post-Cold War world, how would you write that? I genuinely want to know. Thank you.
I would have I'll have mine of the One Goal Initiative for governance. I would like to suggest maybe a definition for Cold War. There'll be a non-kinetic war preceding 1991.
Let's take D3 and then go on.
So these were three.
Yes, exactly. So
Okay.
yeah.
So here's the last one. Let me think about this. I think non-kinetic, conflict. That might be a good way to think about it. But I sort of draw a blank now of that issue. Let me start with the first one. The first question sort of goes back to this one problem that has already been mentioned. Was at the end of the panel, the previous panel, which I followed. Is how do we look at the Middle East? This is an outside-in, non-inside-out, right? With the engagement with the outside world. I mean, are we interested in how the outside world or the global Cold War engaged with the Middle East, or are we interested in how the Middle East engaged with the global Cold War? And over many, many years now, this is the reason why I wrote the book, have become frustrated with this idea that, in fact, the world is run out of Washington and Moscow, let's say London over there. Frustrated because you read the documents in the National Security Council meetings in the 50s under Eisenhower, the Kennedy in the 60s, or you read actually the Politburo meetings that have been partially released by Fosenko, the 3 volumes. One thing you realize is that these governments don't really shape the world a lot. They react to a lot of crises that are popping up all the time. So there are fire departments to extinguish or trying to extinguish a fire and affair there. So this led me to a question: where is actually agency in the Cold War? Do we really have agency of the great powers, superpowers later, 1960s, or is there something going on we are just missing? My answer is, that we have an enormous amount of American documentation because so much has been produced. Just in terms of sheer volume, the United States produced much, much more than the Soviet Union papers. A lot of documents, a lot of it has been declassified. We can read it, and we might actually get just a very American view, or very much a superpower view. and we might lose lose sight of what is going on in the region, where agency actually happens. And I think here, my sense is that yes, the Americans and the Soviets might think about, that one or the other is invading in Iran in 1979, but the reality is it's not happening. Right? The reality is that Iran is becoming a player. It becomes an important player in the war against Iraq. It mobilizes Shia populations across the Arab world. It's involved in uprising against the Saudi kingdom. So these are the things that I'm interested in. Where is actually agency really located, right? And for me, the classical case where I think we miss a lot is 1953. Iran, where just looking at American and British documents, Secret Service documents, we miss the story of Iran. And Cyrus has already mentioned that. I mean, the same case is the coup in Chile in 1973, which the Americans supposedly were running, and that Tanya Harmer writes this wonderful book showing that's actually a Latin American show. The Americans aren't really that important. They were important after 73 in Chile, they were important after 53 in Iran. But my point is that maybe the documents mislead us. The sheer mass of documents we have, that they mislead us. So I'm really interested in trying to define where agency, trying to figure out where agency is, who's running the show. And yes, there's an inequality in terms of power, but military power might not be the only thing actually that matters here, or American military power. Now, this was a long answer. I want to talk about the conclusion. What should be included and how would I write the conclusion? That's my big question. Now, this goes also back to a previous discussion of the previous panel, which I followed. Yes, there's a kind of a unipolar moment. And the question is this planned by the Americans since World War II, or is this something that sort of actually just emerges and it works in favor of the Americans? So the Gulf War definitely has to be in there in one form. It is, so the 90s is the period of American primacy, but we also now, I think, understand now that in the last quarter of a century, maybe that primacy has been challenged at all levels. And it goes back in this discussion about China, it goes back in the discussion, it goes back also a discussion that Putin really wants, what his goals are in Ukraine and in the former borderlands of the Soviet Empire, whether he wants to overthrow, usually is understood as the liberal world order, right? The rules-based order, which is very much in danger now, I think. So, I have to think about what I put in there. But the Gulf War definitely is, for me, one of these turning points as well. And I want to hear from Cyrus what he thinks, how it should be actually located in the volume.
Time at the end, let's do this, okay? Can I have it quickly?
Yes, Jeremy? No, go for it.
Person, then I'll add
I just had a very specific question for you about something you mentioned in the chapter, and you mentioned it just quickly in your presentation about Israel, the perception of Israel in the United States shifting from to Israel becoming an asset. And if I'm not mistaken, you locate that already by the mid-1950s. Maybe you meant after the Suez War, which strikes me as being on the early side. And I'd be interested to hear from you a little bit more about what you think explains the shift for the United States and why you put it in that time period, and maybe how you see it evolve, that relationship, over the next decade or so. Sorry, by decade, I mean from the mid-1950s into the 1960s.
Cyrus, can I just jump in quickly? Yes, because I realized I didn't answer a question from before as well, that sort of ties to this question.
Of course. Right. Please.
This is also the question of 1964, which I haven't answered. So I don't see 1956 as the turning point of Israel becoming strategic asset. I see this in the 10 years that follow. the Americans are quite frustrated with Israel in 1956. They are not necessarily supporting Israel immediately after 1956. I think this is a process that started in under Kennedy and going into Johnson. It's largely a fear of a rising Egypt, right? Possibly nuclear Egypt. There's a fears that there might be a nuclear conflagration in the Middle East, and that, it's tied again to containing Arab nationalism, right? It's seen as a threat because it's allied with the Soviet Union. So I see this as a slow process over time. And one of the papers actually mentioned this, if I remember correctly. There's also that leads them, I think Lorena De Vita's paper actually has it about the German delivery of weapons that then lead to problems for West Germany 64. That is all tied to this story. So it's a long process, and that leads back to this issue about 64. Why is 64 important? And this is again the question about, are we looking at the Middle East from the outside, or are we looking actually at the Middle East from the inside? And this is a new attempt a renewed attempt by Nasser to sort of overcome inner Arab conflicts, to overcome Malcolm Kerr's the Arab Cold War, right? Nasser realizes how much he has actually isolated Egypt, not only from the United States, but also from the Soviet Union increasingly, and how many the United Arab Republic has collapsed, the United Arab States with Yemen that has collapsed. There's war between Saudi Arabia and Egypt or Yemen. So this is an attempt now to sort of reconcile with as many actors as possible. And the unifying motive is to go after Israel. Right. That's make Israel actually in the primary enemy at the rhetorical level. And this is why I think 64, the two Arab summits, also the creation of the PLO at the summits is actually for me the sort of the important point. To come back, periodization, we love periodizations, we are historians, because that allows us to order the past and to make it accessible to our students. So in that way, I see 56 to maybe 64, 65, 66 as this transitional phase where Israel is seen before as actually a regional liability and becomes a strategic asset. I hope that makes sense.
Okay, let me just first address your question, how I see the place of the chapter, and we'll talk more about this by email, of course. I still do think that it ought to be basically the chapter that opens after the introduction, because I do think that it probably relates to the biggest number of chapters that come. And I do think, as I had mentioned this, that it would be good to have cross-references that they will help everybody basically to do, so that we see where things connect, but also really, I think, importantly, where people disagree. And I think that's actually something that we may want to note as well, because I think it's actually really important. Let me just add one more point, like something just to think about, and again, this is something that we can then, discuss. So right now, we sort of have, like Osama, right? So we said, well, there is this sort of really old-fashioned, traditional way of looking at the Cold War, where basically both of these superpowers are more or less equal and they're battling it out. This is clearly not the case. You have explained in your way why this is, and you, Lawrence, as well. And you very clearly the fact that there is a sort of competition at all only between 67 and 73-4 basically is Lawrence's reflection of what you're saying in a certain sense, right? So there are two versions of the same, broadly speaking, two versions of the same argument. But maybe there is another way of thinking about this, which is to say that perhaps, and I don't know that this is true at all, and I want to ask Guy about this, right? Guy, here you are, right? So could one say that the Soviet Union ultimately doesn't even try to compete with the United States? I mean, this is both for Guy and for Lawrence, right? And also for maybe for for Bill and for and Jeremy. Do they maybe not even try to compete at the same level? Because here are two ways of thinking about this. One would be oil, right? All they want is to somewhat disrupt Western oil and to create a situation where they can sell more oil. They succeed. The other one is anti-containment. And when you think about anti-containment, you would actually start to see that the few countries that they do hold on to are very interestingly situated. Why? Because they are very close to the Soviet Union. And another one, Libya, is in the Eastern Mediterranean, and that's important for them for naval reasons. And they very quickly, by the basically late 50s Iran and early 60s, Turkey, they basically are able to create a situation where American forces in those two countries, or basically national forces, are not a direct threat to them anymore. So if you look at it from this point of view, could you say, maybe the Soviet Union doesn't even want to get more out of this? This is all they want. Which would then also mean that would be the last step, and this is a general note on the way in which where you locate the intersection between the global Cold War and the regional Cold War. In your narrative, the intersection happens along the Arab-Israeli conflict axis. But what happens when we think about this along other axes or along other themes, like, for instance, oil, or like, for instance, containment, counter-containment? If we do it this way, do we see other periodizations of the global Cold War? And I'm not saying this to say, oh, now let's rewrite the whole chapter, right? But to think about these really top-level different ways of at all framing the question. So I don't know whether Guy and you can sort of have a quick back and forth about this.
I'll be happy.
Yeah? So do you want to give this to Guy, then maybe Lorenz can also weigh. Lorenz, is that okay?
Yes, I mean, I anyway talk with Guy all the time.
Okay.
That's true. That's also true. Yeah, I just want to note that the two superpowers are by each other here, and there's no Cold War. Hi, Osama. I think that, of course, as someone who's writing the chapter about the Soviet Union, I would resist anything that would write the Soviet Union out of the story as a, okay. I think in the mind of the Soviets, who are, basically most of them are Russians, the United States in the Middle East inherits the role of Great Britain, and that's why I mentioned the Great Game at the opening of my chapter. It's true that the Soviet Union had more impact on the countries that were closest to its borders, but the Soviet Union is in a way responsible for the establishment of modern Turkey. Also for the establishment of modern Israel. I mean, I give only a paragraph about that, but David Ben-Gurion said, without Soviet weapons, $22 million. That's a big sum in those days. That was big. 300,000 Jews immigrated to Israel during the 1948 war. Many of them were taken from the port instantly to the battle lines because Israel had a big problem of man shortage at the time. What I'm trying to say is that the Soviet Union was impactful in the Middle East before the 60s and 70s. I fully accept, and I also quote Lawrence on this as an authority, that when we get to the 80s, certainly by the mid-80s, the Soviet Union is no longer a power player in the Middle East, and as I said, Gorbachev completely petitions the attempt to compete with the US in the region. Also, going back to a point that Osama made, obviously there's a big disparity of capabilities between the United States and the Soviet Union. I think the Soviets were really good about, taking the meager resources they had and using them strategically, okay? We're talking about the superpower that built the Aswan Dam. It built the dam over the Euphrates River, creating, Lake Nasser and Lake Assad. So I think that although there were disparities of capabilities between the superpowers, the Soviet Union was impacted, was impactful, did influence the region, and I'd argue for a continuity that starts from the end of World War II and ends sometime in the early or mid-'80s.
Well, shall I just jump in?
Yes, this is your
Okay.
the last word is yours.
Okay, well, thank you. Again, I'm sorry I'm not there. I would not like to go to dinner with you and continue to talk, right, and then over breakfast and talk about the papers tomorrow. They are also super interesting. But a lot of what Guy has said, does resonate with where I stand. I mean, we have known each other now for almost 20 years, and we talk about this quite frequently. Now, I agree with Osama, that the Soviet and the United States are not equals, right, in terms of capabilities, and the Americans overestimate some capabilities and intentions. But that doesn't mean that in the self-perception of the Soviets, that they believe and they want to be equals, and they want to actually be superior. And their own self-perception with détente, which Osama mentioned earlier, is we are now considered to be equals, and this is the transition from actually Soviet inferiority to equality to Soviet superiority, right, in their own intellectual actually world. So the Soviets compete as equals, in my view, very clearly in Europe. In Asia, that we might not discuss this, but they are not equals in the Middle East. There's no doubt about that. So what is, and I agree with Guy, well, the Soviets have meager resources. They use them actually quite well, but it's not enough. They bet ultimately on war horses in the Middle East, right? And then what they are left with, particularly after, I think, 73, is to support actually spoilers in the Middle East to any solution, particularly of the Arab-Israeli conflict. And this goes back to something that Jan Gross has written way back about the Soviet intervention in Poland in 1939, that what the Soviets are particularly good at is at being a spoiler state. I mean, Russians, right? And we see this again, I think, with Putin, If you can't play in the same league with the other great powers, what you can be is you can be a spoiler. You can actually try to undermine, anti-containment might be actually a good way, you try to undermine the game of the others, right? And to spoil it with few resources. So where should we go back to Cyrus's last question? Where should we locate what we call now the Cold War? This will be probably in the title of the volume somehow, the Cambridge Companion to the Cold War in the Middle East. I think that or something like that. Now, is it the Israeli-Arab-Zionist conflict? Yes, I see this as one, but maybe I should emphasize more. I see also that there's an Arab conflict. I already mentioned that one fault line is between the Hashemites, the Saudis, and the Egyptians, and there's they dance with each other. Eventually, they end up on the same side for a short period of time in the 70s, right? Is it also, a conflict between secularism and, Islamism, right? We might want to think about this too, right? That this is one of the big fault lines in the Middle East that to certainly do engage, but also refuse to engage as the Cold War. Or is it containment and anti-containment? Maybe you have to make this more clear